Welcome to Something Positive for Positive People. I'm Courtney Brain. Something Positive for Positive People is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides mental health resources for people who've experienced the trauma of a positive STI diagnosis. Today I am here with Sierra, and no, not my ex-girlfriend, but Sierra on Instagram, who I saw that you had posted something to your Instagram story that was a repost of someone that I'm connected to on Instagram who will be a guest on the Something Positive for Positive People podcast at some point, Safe Slut. And I believe it was, nope, I don't even want to butcher it because I'm wanting to say bad bitch and herpes. I forget exactly what it was, but what was it?
I think it was herpes positive and still a bad bitch.
Yeah, I love how you say it.
Yeah.
You say it like you kind of getting away with something. Like the way I see it in your face, you're kind of cheesy about it. Uh, I'm curious what inspired the story that you shared along with that. And you don't have to say it verbatim, but like, can you just share a little bit of the wording that you shared along with the repost on your story?
Yeah. I had been, so I was diagnosed almost exactly a year ago. And for a while, I've been wanting to post something on my story or just like it's been pretty like under the wire. Like my close friends know about it, my parents know about it. But it was never like my diagnosis was never something that I talked about publicly. And so I was wanting to kind of say something about it. I originally had like an idea of making it on like a feed post and like making it more interactive and more detailed. And I had been going through positive results. Us like is another account that I follow, Ray. And then Christina also. I've kind of been like looking at their feeds over the last week, like, okay, if I'm gonna post something, like what might I repost? It was always kind of the plan to repost something from their account. Um, and then it popped up the herpes positive and still a bad bitch with like the little Bratz doll and like the great like purple color scheme. That popped up on my feed after I'd had just like a really bad day, and it came up late at night. It was like 11:30, and it popped up, and I was like, like fuck it, like let's just go. Like I don't really have it in me to like make a whole huge post, but like I think it popped up on my feed like when I wanted to see it, and I just made the snap decision like, okay, like I just want to talk about this. This is something that I feel like I really want to not like get off my chest, but something that I thought was important to finally make visible. There's been so much shame, like the whole story is such a mess. Like I was just like, I kind of want to reclaim this. I want to make it mine. I feel like I knew nobody um, who was herpes positive when I was diagnosed, nobody in my close friend group. So I was like, okay, if there's anybody who's following me or not following me or whatever who stumbles across this, like, I want to be able to help somebody feel comfortable and safe and seen because I wasn't. So that was kind of the thought process. And it was really, it felt like very empowering to just like post it and then like go to sleep. Like, that's all I did.
What happened when you woke up?
I had a lot of messages from my friends and people who are saying like, people who I've chatted with, but just popping in and being like, wow, like this is really great. Like I'm really proud of you. Like thank you for this, or doing the little like 100 emoji or the little like woohoo like clappy hands emoji. It was nice. It felt like it resonated the way that I had hoped it would, and yeah, I just feel like I feel so much better being visible about it. Like I was really tired of just like seeing stuff pass through my feed, like from all the accounts that I follow and wanting to reshare, but knowing I would kind of have to like I'd want to have a preface to it. I just wouldn't want to like pop it in there and be like, hey, by the way,
Yeah.
I have herpes. Like I think I wanted to like say something about it rather than just post and go. Um, yeah, it was a good response, and it was like a good feeling that I don't feel like I've had for the last year, kind of like dealing with this diagnosis and all of the shit, that came with it. So,
Right.
yeah.
When you say this was a response that you'd hoped for, was there a different response that you sort of foresaw other than this one?
Not really, because I think like the people who follow me are generally like we run in the same circles. I kind of curate my follower list. If somebody follows me that I'm just like we're not there, like it's gone. Like I kind of have my little social media bubble. But I think there's just like a lot of nervousness, especially with the men in my life, I think I was never concerned about how the women in my life like would perceive this post, but always like I think there's just such a question of like, okay, how does me being herpes positive affect like how men are attracted to me, and just like who are these like random men on my feed, like who I work with or who I've just known, in passing, like how's that going to change things? So I didn't really like think about it too much, but that I never expected any of the women in my life to message like this is so gross, but I feel like a little bit more hyper aware of like my proximity to the men and like past relationships especially. So I don't know. I almost like don't care like at this point, but I couldn't have done that a year ago. Like I don't think.
Okay. When you
Yeah.
say that about the men, just
Hmm.
does that have anything to do with your sexual attraction, perhaps, or like your value as someone, um, as a partner? Like, did you more so value or identify with your identity in relation to partnerships than
Hmm.
friendships with women? Is that kind of why you looked at men's opinions to be
Totally.
carry more weight?
Yeah. 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 Totally. I think like I always have this like little voice in the back of my head that's like, well, people aren't gonna find you attractive or they're not gonna want to date you because of this. And like that's been like was one of my like biggest like realizations a year ago when I was diagnosed. I was like, oh shit, like this changes the game, and it totally has. I think something that I see so much like positivity around it, and if like this doesn't define you, like let's slay the stigma, and I'm like yes, like 100%. And also there, for me it was like yes, let's slay the stigma, but it still comes with so much weight. It's not, I don't see it as like, oh, whatever, my life is the same. I just have herpes. It's like, no, like my life fundamentally changed, and like my relationship to sex and dating and casual sex like has completely had to change. So that's been really, really challenging. So I think that was kind of feeding into that, like, okay, well, like how am I perceived then? Like how is this changing how I'm being witnessed by other people who I wouldn't even want to have sex with, but who might then be like, oh, I would never have sex with her. It's like, why is that a concern for me? I don't know, but I think it's like this diagnosis is so tied up in like, I guess like worth or like sexual worth or attraction, and that's been really challenging.
Yeah. What I find is that how we view STIs in general, after we become exposed to them, we begin to identify with them because our self
Mhm.
image is so interconnected with our sexuality.
Mhm.
When we introduce ourselves to people or when we're in pursuit of partners and relationships and talk about identities, often the beginning point is something under the umbrella of sexuality. Like I'm straight,
Mhm.
right? Or like I like this is what I like. These are things that
Yep.
I like to do in terms of how intercourse is had, or like
Mhm.
if we look at fatherhood, motherhood, even those fall under the umbrella of sexuality. So
Totally.
our identity becomes so challenged upon diagnosis that when we get that, we're just like, who am I? you know,
Yeah.
and
Totally.
we seek some sort of validation and assurance of who we are. So I wanted to preface the question I'm about to ask you with that statement because I'm curious to know, were you validated in your identity by the men who responded to your public disclosure?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's just so interesting. I think the reason like the diagnosis was so like devastating was because I had spent like the year prior. So I ended, I exited a relationship with a very like a long term relationship, almost 5 years, with the first person that I'd ever had sex with. And as we grew apart, like our sex life definitely grew apart. We very rarely had sex, and I like for a while like was like, oh, okay, like I must be asexual. And that was like something I was kind of exploring and leaning into. And so then after I exited that relationship, I was able to sort of like rediscover my sexuality when I moved to a new city and, was using Tinder for the first time at like age 22. And so I felt like I was in a little bit of a sprint to like catch up on what I'd missed. And, me 2 years ago was so like tied to what men thought of her and like I wanted to feel sexy and like approachable and I wanted to feel that validation because it was something that I hadn't experienced before. And so I had a pretty like good year for the year that I lived in that new city, and then I moved to New York City where I am now, and I was feeling pretty good. Like I was on birth control. Like I was like I kind of had it all curated. Like I had this like perfect, sexy image of myself that I was ready to like explore in New York City. And very soon after I moved here was when things kind of blew up, and I got that diagnosis. So I think that was like why it was so devastating, because I went from being this very like empowered like sexual person who was like rediscovering herself and kind of discovering for the first time what I really liked, and then all of a sudden boom, like here's this like lifelong diagnosis. And I feel like that's a pretty common like that happens to so many people who I've talked to, where it's like, oh nope, you have to rethink everything now. Like I feel like I can never access that same person again, and that was like devastating. I cried for like 3 days, like after I found out, and yeah, it was really challenging. So yeah, my self worth was so tied to like whether or not I was like worthy or good enough or sexy enough to be in a relationship or like desired by men, and that's something I've had to really really work on.
Was this your first ever STI diagnosis?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was like, damn, they couldn't have given me like chlamydia or something that I could take a pill for. Damn, like it was, yeah, it was like I hadn't thought I was invincible by any means, and I was really thought I was really really good about protection, and I was frequently tested more than once a year. I think I was tested after every partner, and I had been, I'd had sex with a lot of people before I moved to New York City. There were at least like four or so people who I'd had sex with that year. So I was feeling like, okay, whatever I'm doing it right. Like I'm being safe, like I'm communicating really well, I'm on birth control, like there was always really open dialogue. And then I don't know if maybe like I got sloppy or I just forgot how to communicate in a new place because I was overwhelmed and I was so excited. But yeah, like really the first two partners that I had sex with here in the city. I don't know I don't know who it was, and I will never know. And that's something I also had to kind of like, okay, I have to reconcile with this. This is my thing. But yeah, it was pretty soon out the gate. Like I moved here in end of July, like early August, and then got the diagnosis in November. So it was a really like hard and fast wake up call to a new city.
Yeah. And can you walk me through everything from the diagnosis, from your first symptom to when you found out that this was herpes?
Yeah. Yeah, gosh, everything was happening very fast at that point. I was super busy and was like feeling good in my sexuality and just like feeling very desired. Like it was a good feeling. I felt very wanted by like the men in my life. And then I think it's just like honestly a series of like miscommunications with condom use, which was another thing I really had to kind of come to terms with. But we can get into that later. But obviously there was some exposure happened, and I was aware that I had like probably fucked up, and was like, oh, okay, like I'm not expecting anything bad to happen, but I'm gonna go get tested anyway. Came back all fine. So I started having symptoms beginning of November. But the problem was it's just like a mess. I had been on a birth control method that was causing just like uncontrollable bleeding. So that was something that was already happening. I had like 4 yeast infections and bacterial infections back to back to back to back as soon as I got to the city, because I guess humidity and new sexual partners like ruined my body. So it was actually really hard to tell what was going on. And so I remember I remember that there was like a tear, or like what felt like a very small tear, and that I had assumed was just because of rougher sex, not enough lubrication, whatever. And I was like, all right, this hurt. I was like, oh, okay, like this hurts, but like I'm easily aggravated, so it wasn't like a big deal. And then it didn't really bother me for about a week. But it wasn't healing, and I was like checking on it, and like at the time it was only that there were no other lesions or anything like that. So like a week went by, and I was like, this is kind of hurting, but it's not a worry. And then after about a week, I started getting like cramps, almost as if like period cramps, but like just in my back and like all the way down my legs. I started to feel like very like just warm and kind of feverish, and my legs started hurting so bad. It hurt to like stand up. It hurt to walk around. I was working two retail jobs at the time, so I mean like the pain was really obvious. And then I kept checking because I'm like, well, I know what my body looks like. I'm pretty actively aware because I've had a bunch of yeast infections, so I was in the practice of like self-examining basically every day. And I noticed that like the little cut had kind of like turned um, more into like what a canker sore looked like, and that was really like my only reference point for it. So I was like, well, that is alarming. Then it started to hurt so bad to pee that I was like, yes, something is wrong. I remember being at work and telling my coworker, I was like, well, I'm gonna go to urgent care like right now after I got off work. So my story is that I found out that I had herpes right before meeting my favorite author of all time, and I couldn't even enjoy meeting my favorite author because I was just told that I had herpes. Um, so I went to urgent care. I had seen this same doctor before because I didn't have health insurance was a mess. So I was always in this urgent care. From like August till November, I was there like 6 times because of just health problems in general. And I just remember describing the symptom, and he was like, oh, well, do you know what herpes is? And I was like, oh, oh, no. Like, and it never really blipped, like, across my mind. I just don't think I knew what it was. I knew what it was, like, in this, like, very vague sense, but I didn't really know what it would look like to get it. And I had just recently been tested for everything else. Didn't know at the time that herpes isn't included in routine STI testing. I thought when I said test me for everything, they would test me for herpes. Now I know better. So he did an exam, and like literally the words out of his mouth were like, "Yeah, this looks herpetic." Like those were the words, and I just remember like feet in the stirrups, being like, "Oh no!" It was just such a horrible feeling, like of like, "Oh no." The nurse tech, who I know by name and who knows me by name at that point, she was like, don't worry, we don't know for sure that's what it is. We're going to send a sample. We'll prescribe you. I think they prescribed me Valtrex like on the spot, but they weren't sure. They were going to send it to the lab and get it looked at. But because at the time there were only 2 lesions, I think. Like it wasn't like some horrible explosion yet. So yeah, I just remember like putting all my clothes back on in the urgent care because they had some like emergent patient next door who they were like, okay, like, well, here's this packet of information, take it with you. We have this emergency patient, and so I was trying to get to the book, the reading event where I was going to meet my favorite author. So I was like, all right, I gotta go. So I just like threw on all my clothes, jumped on a train, got to the reading, and I was just like couldn't even really focus. I was like, oh shit, like this is like forever. Like if this is what it is, it's forever. Um, so yeah, I was kind of in limbo a little bit after that because I think it took a few days for me to get my results back. But at the time I didn't know like who I'd gotten it from. I was kind of like on the outs or like in between a couple relationships at the time. And so I was like, I don't even know what to do. I don't even remember what I did, honestly, during that time. But I think I went home that night and did a lot of Googling and cried myself to sleep. I think that was like the series of events. Um, Gosh, yeah, it was miserable. I just like remember being so miserable and didn't know how to like talk about it to anybody because I had never had a friend, had anybody like experience what I was experiencing. So I was very like, I am in a new city on the outs with the two men that I'd been sort of seeing or having sex with, all alone with this terrible, like, foreboding diagnosis above my head. And then the next morning, I think I like looked and did like a little self-exam again, and I was like, "There's no way it's not this," because it just like got worse. I mean, it was like terrible to look down there. Then fast forward, I was at my other job, um, and got the call from from the doctor at urgent care, and she was like, "So we got your results back. You have HSV1, genital HSV1." And I was like, "Okay, I don't really know what that means." And she was like, "Well, have you had oral sex?" And like that was her terminology. Like that was the question. Have you had oral sex? And I was like, "Yes." Like just me like thinking about like all these like amorphous dicks like floating around my head. Like yeah, like yes. And then I was like, "Well, how could I get it on my vagina from sucking dick?" Like it was so like not like explained, and I was like at work in the basement at the time, and eventually what I found out was that it was likely somebody who had HSV1, like a cold sore, or just like that was where the infection was located, had given it to me orally, like through giving head. But it was so unclear, and like I feel like there's almost no information about genital HSV1 that's like easily accessible, like without digging through a bunch of other stuff. Because as far as I had known, HSV1 was cold sores and HSV2 was genital herpes, and like I didn't know that those things blended, and like it's all basically the same thing at this point. So it was awful. I had no resources. Like I knew nothing about what was going on. It was terrible. It was such a terrible, terrible, terrible time. And I can laugh about it a little bit now, just like how dramatic it all was. But I mean, it was like I was in excruciating pain for like I think the whole like breakout was like 3 weeks. Like it was like and I took even with Valtrex, which I started taking immediately. It really didn't go away for a long, long time. Yeah.
I'm going to take this moment to introduce an ad because literally most of the time that you were talking, like at this time, I usually record now because construction's over with, it's dark outside, and there's nothing happening. Literally, for the last 7 minutes, my neighbor parked in his car, and his parking spot's right outside my apartment, right?
No.
So for whatever reason, it's really, really loud. Like I heard every word of what was said on whatever he was listening to. At the same time,
Oh.
I have a phone that's just in my kitchen, doesn't dial out, doesn't accept calls, never goes off. I guess someone came to the front door of my apartment building and pressed the right button to make it go beep. So someone, I guess, just got let in. A neighbor came home next door. She like came in, left, checked the mail, and then it came back in. And there's a conversation that's happening out there right now. And then
Oh my
whenever my
gosh.
neighbor gets home, the dog upstairs barks. So the dog was barking for a bit, and it barks until he comes in the house. So if anyone's listening and you heard like mild distractions, my apologies. This podcast is brought to you by Let's Get Checked. So visit www.trylgc.com/SPFPP in order to get 30% off of your first at-home STI test kit. And you can even get a COVID test. I'm going to try and keep talking through this while my neighbor and whoever the hell she's talking to right now continue to talk outside extremely loud. And it's so loud while I'm recording this podcast. Okay, I think it just stopped. I don't think they heard me. But anyway, yeah.
If it makes you feel better, I could only hear that last bit of conversation. I couldn't hear anything else. So maybe the viewers won't hear it.
Right. Well, I figured that the rain would have drowned out a lot of this, but it's like, people are like, oh, it's raining outside. Let me get louder. Right?
Yeah, they have to shout over the raindrops.
Yeah. But yeah, so at checkout, use promo code SPFPP and you get 30% off your at home STI test kit. And this is something that, especially in the time of COVID, I mean, if you want to hang out with someone you've been talking on online dating sites or chatting for a while, shit, and you want to order them an at home COVID test kit, the turnaround time is about 5 days from the time that it gets to them, or from the time that you order it. You get it within 3 to 5 days, and then when you send it in, you get your results within 36 hours. So that was my experience with the COVID test and with the STI at home test kit as well. So visit www.trylogic.com. That's without the vowels though. trylg.com/SPFPP. Now, hopefully, all of this noise stops, which I doubt. I'll probably hear it. Y'all probably won't, but like I'm so easily distracted by things when stuff happens, and I'm like, because I'm not editing these podcasts anymore.
Mhm.
I've been doing a much better job of speaking at a consistent pace and removing the likes and ums. As people listen, they'll probably notice that I take much longer pauses now in between asking questions and processing what was just said by the guest. So I don't want you to feel uncomfortable in any of that silence either.
No, I'm chilling. I'm having a great time.
Yeah, you talk so freely about it. How old are you?
I'm 24.
Yeah, I think that there's a very common thing here for younger people who, once they're diagnosed, uh, have more of a willingness to seek support, community, and heal from this. Whereas the older generation tends to avoid it or jump into support groups and allow that to be not just the anchor, but just the limit on
Mhm.
what they allow in terms of their space. Like, if they don't have to tell anyone about this, then they don't tell anyone about this. But for
Mhm.
me, these support groups, these resources, they serve as an anchor of support so that you have the freedom to be as you are in those spaces in the out in the rest of the world. For me, being open about my status, I often share that I don't have any role models. The majority of people, when you Google who has herpes or people with herpes, you see typically white women around the age of 30 years old.
Mhm.
And that's really all you got.
Yep.
So for me, having been diagnosed, I didn't even see a man. For women, I've always felt like it was easier because I've always had this belief that it was way easier for women to get laid than men because of just access to resources.
Mhm.
Men and ourselves, like, we're uber competitive when it comes to dating. And for women,
Mhm.
it's like, all right, well, I'm the chooser. That's how I've always thought about it. Herpes has definitely challenged that perception that I've had, especially being around so many different types of women now and having so many different interactions and seeing just how this STI, this virus, really shifts people's narrative on themselves and how they date. Like, I've spoken with people who have remained in relationships that they should not be in, abusive relationships, toxic relationships, uh, where their partner, their abuser, has been emotionally manipulative towards them because of their positive status.
Mhm.
And in many cases, the person that they're with has been the person who passed the virus on to them. And
Mhm.
so, one thing that something positive for positive people is making an effort for is really integrating our post diagnosis support resources with STD prevention resources. One
Mhm.
common narrative uh, really stems around how people with herpes have navigated dating and relationships and their sex education system. So we want to put that in front of people alongside STD prevention resources. And for when people receive a positive diagnosis, not to feel like they failed or they are, in fact, a failure, but
Mhm.
there's a transition in how to go about things now that doesn't
Yep.
imply that you did anything wrong. And with sex education, I think that there's such a focus on the word sex and what we
Mhm.
think sex means, which is intercourse, right?
Mhm.
That we completely miss the details about learning about the basic functions of our body, learning
Yep.
boundaries, learning to manage and navigate relationships, learning to identify abuse and abusive patterns and how to get out of those, as well as knowing that your no means something. These are
Yep.
the kinds of things that are left out of the conversation around sex education uh, for people like us who have grown up to this point and now tested positive, and we're like, whoa,
Mhm.
sex education failed us because it didn't tell
Mhm.
us about STIs. Actually, sex education failed us because it didn't go into more of the mental health aspects of it, because the powers
Totally.
that be, the people who are there, just are so hyper focused on sex and the fact that it just needs to not be talked about, that we just miss all of the important pieces of the relationships around sex, which can in turn like save lives and save relationships and really liberate people into living their lives. Because this may be true for you, having faced the challenge of a positive STI diagnosis as someone who was newly exploring their sexuality. I bet once you got your diagnosis, you were like, shit, they were right. Like, shit, I shouldn't have done that. Wow,
Yep.
I was so stupid. I'm
Mhm.
so ashamed. I did this wrong. I didn't do the right thing by waiting until marriage. Was that present for you?
Yeah, and not so much like the yeah, I mean, I think there was just so much shame attached to it of like what were the series of steps that like led me to that moment that I could have done differently. I like fully believe that like better communication from both and all parties that I was involved in could have prevented the transmission, and it could have prevented me from getting herpes. At the same time, I really understand that like my body was going through so much other stuff, like so many other illnesses that I just was unfamiliar with, that I didn't protect it well enough. Like I think that my gynecologist said to me, like you've had so many other infections that like your body was just more susceptible to transmission. It's really likely that the person I got it from like wasn't having an active outbreak. These were still things that we talked about. We talked about sexual history. We talked about our STI status. Um, it was just really an unfortunate convergence of events. And yeah, I mean, like the shame and just like, I felt like I almost had to mourn like the sexual person I was becoming. I felt like she's gone now. You know what I mean? Like, because I can't and probably won't have casual sex with people because it requires disclosure. And I just like at this point in my life, I'm not looking for a lot of casual sex. So then, okay, I just won't have it. And that was really hard to kind of confront of like, okay, like it takes a lot for me to feel comfortable enough with somebody to, be intimate with them. Second of all, to feel comfortable enough with that person where I can disclose this diagnosis with them and still then feel comfortable to have sex with them and not feel that I'm untouchable, or like to feel like I've had sex with a few people where I've like felt their apprehension and their caution, and it feels pretty bad. It's like, hey, I respect you and I'm empathetic towards your caution because I don't want you to go through what I went through. But at the same time, now I feel like this like gross, ugly, like untouchable person. So it's like, why are you having sex with me if you're so scared to do it? So that's been hard. That's been really challenging, and just yeah, like the shame of being the person who could pass this on to somebody else was really challenging to overcome, and I think I'm still navigating it.
Hmm. How has this having herpes impacted your relationship and interpretation with the pandemic?
Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah. It's literally, I think I was telling a friend of mine, I was like, so there's COVID and I have herpes. So like that's like two things out the gate that's like I don't want to like really I'm just so cautious now. I think because of this experience of like I have to be kind of in the know, in control, and the issue of disclosure and like how people know about herpes or know about STIs and can freely talk about them, like that's shifted for me. Now it's like the first conversation I have with somebody. And I don't, I've been seeing so many like tweets or like people being like, COVID feels a little bit like herpes in a way that people are ashamed to disclose if they've been exposed to it or have had it. And I'm like, yeah, like that's what it feels like to me. Like people are like feeling they have to keep like their exposures like close to the chest out of some kind of like fear of being judged. And yeah, like there's that. And then I'm like, damn, I don't know if it's worth it to be like going around town having, for me at least, just like I'm just gonna have casual sex in the middle of a pandemic. Also, I have herpes, but that just feels like a whole lot of things floating around in the air, like with another person. And it has really highlighted for me that I need to feel comfortable, like with the person that I'm sleeping with. I need to feel like they have my best interests at heart and I have their best interests at heart. And in the time of COVID, I think that's really challenging. Like for me, at least, with so much health anxiety, having dealt with like the trauma of this diagnosis and the trauma of so many other medical conditions related to my sexuality, I just found out like an HPV diagnosis from God knows when, who knows. So it's like that trauma like has definitely impacted like where I'm willing to put myself in relationships with people. So at the moment, I don't really see myself pursuing a lot of sexual and or romantic relationships because like I gotta do too much unpacking. Like there's too much going on here to invite somebody else in right now, and that's okay. Um, but it's lonely. It was a hard year, I think, to get these like pretty serious diagnoses and then for COVID to hit. Because even if I was gonna then start that like sexual rediscovery over again, now I feel like I can't because of COVID. So it's like kind of like wall after wall that I'm coming up against, and that's been really difficult.
Yeah, in my experience, it's sort of been like a compounded trauma or re-trigger, so to speak, because of the way that we talk about COVID and the
Yeah.
way that nobody talks about herpes. You wear your mask, you wash your hands, and you socially distance, and you might not get COVID, but you still might. You wear condoms, you are careful with the partners that you choose, and you wash your genitals, right?
Yep.
And you may not get an STI, or you might still get an STI. That
Yeah.
conversation isn't being had. And then talking about what happens after you get it.
Yep.
There is a possibility of hospitalization,
Yep.
and there's nothing you can do about it. Go home and stay
Yeah.
home for 2 weeks. And when you get herpes, you get diagnosed, you take Valtrex, and you still got this, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
with COVID, you have to tell people, that you were around ethically that that you may have exposed them to it, and it's like it can be a big deal. It can be a major disruptor in people's lives, or it could just be like, oh shit, cool, I get to stay home for 2 weeks and tell the unemployment that I was at home for 2 weeks, so I get paid for just being at
Yeah.
home. Um,
Yep.
or there's the, oh fuck, I can't believe you put me and my family at risk. And
Yep.
then in this relation to the STI, it's like, I can't believe you did this to me. You ruined my sex life. And
Right.
so it's a re-triggering thing. And for a lot of people, just triggering in general. Um, for many people who've never had a positive STI diagnosis, I've had conversations with like people that I've worked with or trained, my clients, for instance, and the conversation, the way that they talk to me about it, and the way that I like ask questions, I ask it in a way that allows for them to say, "Yeah, I feel like I'm disclosing like an STD or something." I just look and I'm like, "Ah, okay, you know what it feels like
Yup.
now, right?"
Yup.
Uh, those parallels are definitely something that I'm seeing more people speak on. Emily
Yeah.
DePass of Sex Education,
Yep.
SEXELD Education, is someone who speaks about this or has spoken about this pretty often on her Instagram page. So you can go and check that out if you're interested in more of the information. Um, And it's been something that's really been on my mind lately. Like, if and when this pandemic does finally end, how will this shift our conversations about sexual health, about health, period? Because now, people are more apt to ask, when's the last time you were tested for COVID? Have you had it?
Yep.
Who have you been around? And we're assessing
Mm-hmm.
our risk based on who's worth getting COVID from,
Yep.
just like we would, but we don't do that with STIs. We should with
Yeah.
STIs. Like, all
Right.
right, well, if I got an STI from this person, I'd be okay, right?
Yeah.
that's such a weird thing to say, but it's so
Yeah.
real. It's such a real thing to
Yeah.
consider because that's exactly how we're navigating COVID. You know,
Yep. Yep.
not everyone's wearing a mask around everyone, not everyone's social distancing, and there's this thing called skin hunger where we're depriving ourselves from intimate physical contact with people. Dating app use is still at an all-time high. That's not going to
Absolutely. Yeah.
change. Yeah, so like some people are operating from a place of morality and doing their part and just suffering from skin starvation, and you've got people who are just kind of like, I don't care, right?
Yeah.
Living their lives, doing
Yeah.
what it is that they do. And then you've got people who also are doing it out of necessity. Like there's the discouraging of us to be around people in social settings and restaurants, bars, and things like that. But what about going to work? Like if I
Right.
don't go to work, I don't eat. Like I still have to
Yep.
go on my commute. I still have to be in the space with the people who I'm providing a good or service for. And these
Yep.
people are still having to go to work and they have to do the things that they do. And so uh, I'm very shocked that this conversation is being had the way that it is and handled the way that it is. Yet when we discuss STIs, like it's not. like
Yeah.
it's possible that you can do everything that you're told and you still get COVID. And the same thing
Mm-hmm.
with HSV, same thing with HPV,
Yeah.
same thing with other STIs. So
Yeah. It feels like this very like no gray area conversation. I think with STIs a lot of the time they're like, well, wear a condom. Okay.
yeah,
Cool. Did that. You still got herpes. You know what I mean? Like, and I wish. I think that nuance like really needs to be applied to like both situations. Like you can do all of the precautionary things and you can still get it. So what's the next step after that? Because I think for both STIs and for COVID, there's not the next step. Like it's like just don't get it. Like that's like the only thing. You're like just try not to get it.
yeah,
But like long COVID is a thing. Like those people who have experienced COVID symptoms for like months and months and months after their diagnosis. Like there are so few resources for them. For people who are diagnosed with herpes, it's a lifelong thing. Like that's a huge thing to contend with. And like, what are the next steps? Like it's literally just like, okay, take your antivirals, go. Like
mm-hmm.
this is your life now. And I wish that nuance was applied. I think across the board of like, not only does this I don't know. I just feel that it now is like almost my like duty is like a very strong word, but like
Moral
I feel like I can
obligation.
moral obligation. I feel like I can never in good conscience put somebody in the situation that I was put in. Just because of lack of communication and lack of knowledge and lack of education about herpes and about everyone's status. Like I never would want to put anybody in that situation, both with COVID and with herpes. Like
Yeah.
it just puts me in this position where I'm like, damn, I've got this moral obligation and I'm protecting other people, but damn, it's a heavy weight
Have you
in
had
both cases.
Have you had sex since your diagnosis?
Yes,
Oh,
yeah, I've
okay. I
had,
was like,
yeah, yeah,
oh.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Don't worry. Yeah, no, I had sex actually like pretty. Well, it was interesting. I met somebody on a dating app, and we were talking before. No, when was it? I think I matched like right before I was diagnosed. Then we still met up after. But then I had mono also, so it was like a series of like very fucked up illnesses, like all in a row. So we did end up hooking up, and it was the first person that I had sex with after the diagnosis, and it was fine. Like, but I did feel that feeling of like the anxiety
Yeah.
from the other person of like, we have to be careful, we have to be careful, we have to be careful. It's like, okay, well, if you're that nervous, we don't have to have sex. I'm not coming into this like expecting us to have sex, like, but it still happened. So I was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, that was, we could have just hung out. We could have just made out. You know, like there were a lot of other options rather than like, let's put it in. Um, so yeah, no, like I at this point now feel pretty comfortable in my routine with like disclosing to people and just like the communication that I have with them. Um, but it's a little bit exhausting kind of going into these like shorter relationships. I've dated a couple of people in the last year that were, you know, like longer term. And just the prospect now, like I'm just recently out of, you know, like a 6 month, 5 month, like little situationship, like dating somebody. And the thought of kind of going through all of the labor to like feel comfortable with somebody, kind of time the moment of the disclosure, how to not feel hurt if I'm rejected, like all of those things, I feel like I don't really want to do it again, like right now, at least. And, you know, I think that's something I haven't heard spoken about a lot. I've heard the like, let's, you know, like, this is stigmatized. We can have conversations about it. You should have conversations about it. But I haven't necessarily like heard about like disclosure fatigue. Like we're talking about COVID and pandemic fatigue, but I think disclosure fatigue is huge, and I'm experiencing it right now. And you know, it's hard to like. I just want to be like whatever about it, but I can't morally. I won't,
It's
but I'm like, damn.
yeah, it's interesting timing for you to speak on this because I recently asked Instagram if this was a topic that they wanted to get into. Someone had shared with me that they were just tired. They're tired
Yeah,
of telling someone and then being the educator and then having to
yeah,
wait on their response and wait on them to decide whether or not they're worth it and just being in limbo about it. And yeah, that's actually a real thing, and it's not exclusive to herpes disclosures. It's also exclusive. I'm sorry. It also includes um, disclosing whether or not you want children, whether or not you want to
yeah,
get married, whether or not you have children, if you have a disability, whether it be mental or physical, um, any additional like goals, political views, religious views, all of these things are disclosures. And when you date, when you go into relationships and you have to, you know, give this information to potential partners, you run the risk of not only rejection due to incompatibility, but you also run the risk of having to become that person's teacher in a way.
yep,
You know, if
yep,
someone were to tell me 2, 3 years ago that they were non-binary, and this is someone that I'm pursuing, and I'm constantly uh, using she or her language toward them when they go by them or they, then that can become draining for them, and that can make the relationship not work out because they have to continue to correct me, right?
totally,
And then
absolutely.
everything else that goes along with something along those lines, it can be a real drain. So, going into detail about disclosure fatigue is something I'm going to cover in an upcoming episode. Still
Amazing.
trying to decide if I'm going to have a guest on for that one or not, but it's very much something that needs to be discussed and needs to be highlighted. And honestly, I want to use a better word for disclosure, just because of what it's associated with. When you hear the word disclose, I find that to be a little bit triggering in itself because it's,
Yeah,
you know, it comes with this moral responsibility of having to be the person who carries all of the burden of talking
totally.
about STIs or opening up the conversation, because even that can be something that's draining and presents fatigue because you have to carry this. You got to think about, all right, at what point in the night am I going to have this conversation? So, all of these are very, very real things and worth touching on for sure. Um, we're approaching the end of our time together. So, is there anything that you maybe didn't get to say that you want to say here to the audience? Or if you could just speak to one person, even if it's yourself a little bit over a year ago, what would you tell yourself or that person?
Oh my gosh. Um, I think sexual like openness and like being candid with a partner and just I don't know. I think communication and just like open communication, being present for the other person and listening to your partner is like can solve so many sexual and romantic issues. And I think that, oh gosh, like just being, this is so dumb, but just like being true to like your desires and like what you're looking for in a relationship with somebody else. And I don't know, being able to handle and deal with, I guess, like internally. Here's what I'll say. I hate the saying that's like, you can't love, nobody can love you until you learn to love yourself. Like, I hate that, and I think it's very untrue. But at the same time, I wish me a year ago had been more confident in unpacking, like, the sexual trauma or, sexual misunderstandings that I had about myself. And I wish I'd been able to do that in private instead of seeking validation from, like, external sources, because I think my insecurity and my desire to kind of catch up on everything that I'd missed out on sexually was a contributing factor to the miscommunication that led to my exposure and my diagnosis. So, um, yeah, like sex is really hard and challenging, and I don't think there's like a right way to talk about it. But I would really hope that, if you are a person seeking a sexual relationship with somebody, that you go into it with the expectation that like you're gonna have to have some deep conversations, or should maybe, I don't know, I think we should change the way that we talk about sex and casual sex, because I've had casual sexual experiences that left me feeling very unseen and very just like, why am I doing this if it's literally just technical? Like, I want to feel that I am attentive to that partner, and I want to feel that I am like helping that partner feel good. And in order to do that, I have to know a little bit more about them. And some people have casual sex and it's great, and like that's what they do, and it's amazing. They're good at it. But for me as a person, I need a little bit more to work with, and I'd just like love to see that conversation opened more, so it's not just like casual sex, then you're in a relationship. It's like, no, like sex is so nuanced and varied and beautiful and weird and like ugly, like sex isn't just one thing. And in order to better, I guess, like open communication for STIs and herpes, like we just got to kind of open communication across the board, like make it something fun and inviting rather than something to be afraid of, because I was very afraid, and now I'm no longer afraid. I'm like, hey world, I have herpes, and like that's okay, let's talk about it. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Sierra.
yeah, thank you.
We want to normalize the conversations.
Absolutely.
Normalization of STIs. That's just something that I don't believe is realistic.
Yeah.
Like we're not going to talk about STIs the way that we talk about the common code because of how we
No.
talk about sex. Until we
Yeah.
can begin to view sex as the all-encompassing element of life that it is, which
Yep.
is interconnected to mental health, we'll never get there, right?
Absolutely.
So again, just going back to our identities, our sexual identities are, that's where many of us look at who we are. Like that's where we have our identities validated through our most intimate connections with others. And physical sex is oftentimes the starting point for us.
Yeah.
So we'll close out this podcast episode here. And if you're someone who is interested in joining a community, I have created the Something Positive for Positive People Facebook podcast community on Facebook. If you want to be a part of that, just send me a friend request and DM me as well. I DM everyone who requests to join just to make sure you're a real person and you heard about this through the podcast, because this is the only way that I'm talking about it. I do not know what this community is going to become. So right now there's not a lot of activity. I try and check in every now and then to make sure people know that I am there and I'm active on it, but fulfilling a lot of the executive director duties, managing the podcast. I just finished up yoga teacher training. Tomorrow actually is my graduation. Today is Saturday, November 21st. Is today 21st? Okay, good.
Yes.
And yeah, so I think this will be uploaded this upcoming week actually. So this will be the next episode, 159 or 160. Yeah, I've been all over the place. It's
okay.
been
Time is fake.
Yes, it's been such a wonderful past month. Just transitioning into a full-time executive director role for something positive for positive people, which all that means is more of the behind the scenes stuff requires my attention because I'm now reaching out to people and making contact with individuals who can in fact provide a significant amount of funding for us that can pay me a salary as well as pay for people who are struggling with STI stigma after their diagnosis to receive mental health services. So all of your support, however you can, means a lot. So if you can either make a donation, if you can share your story on the podcast, if you can leave a review, share our resources, go to Instagram or Twitter, Tumblr, Reddit at H on My Chest, and just uplift this platform because of all of the work that it is capable of and where its arms are extending and reaching out into other spaces and bringing in the normalization of STI-related conversations and normalizing conversations around STI disclosure and knowing what your status is. Again, my goal is never going to be to end the stigma. I just want to give people the tools they need in order to navigate it in the way that they choose. Till next time, stay sex positive.